I am so sorry for what I'm about to do. Today we're going to be looking at Protection Warrior on the public test realm and talking about how they feel so far with a new tier set, accompanied with the heavy-handed rage nerfs that definitely were not heartbreaking or class-shattering. Naturally, Blizzard can always make changes in the upcoming weeks, which I will talk about later in this video and what I think should be changed. But if needed, this is a safe place for Warrior tiers, and there will be tissues down in the comment section. Anyways, let's take a walk. Just to quickly explain, in patch 11.1, Blizzard is giving all the tanks the same luck of the draw buff as a part of their 2-set bonus. This is going to be accompanied with a 15% damage gain for a handful of seconds, with a random proc of your class's major defensive. The 4-set extends on this by empowering a certain spell while you have luck of the draw active. For the Warrior, the 2-set reads each time you take damage you have a chance to cast Shield Wall for 4 seconds, and gain luck of the draw, which increases your damage dealt by 15% for 10 seconds. The 4-set builds on this. During luck of the draw, Shield Slam's chance to critically strike is increased by 50%, and its critical strike reduces the cooldown of shield charge by 6 seconds. While random procs of Shield Wall aren't necessarily game-changing in any regard, the 4-set has some interesting interactions behind it. Shield Charge is a near capstone talent option that's been somewhat of a staple of the class since Dragonflight, and this ability allows the Warrior to have a solid burst of damage on a 45-second cooldown, and the extended capstone talents, specifically Champion's Bulwark, grants shield block on use, making maintaining your primary mitigation extremely easier. Now, the cooldown reduction you are getting from the Shield Slam critical strikes have the potential to make this set fairly enjoyable, and I'm going to elaborate on this during dungeon testing. But first, I do need to address the doomsday cloud that is approaching. Let's talk about the severely overdealt rage nerfs and my thoughts on them. So Blizzard had a blue post that read, "Protection Warrior are currently constantly flooded with..." I'm not doing the voice. They're constantly flooded with rage, which undermines rotational defensive decision-making and encourages constant dumping of rage into ignore pain to maximize effectiveness. We're taking a pass at reducing Protection's overall rage generation to make decisions on when and how they spend it more meaningful, without reducing Protection Warrior's ability to tank effectively. Spoiler alert, they can't tank effectively, at least in single target, but I'm going to get to that in a second. In order to address the feelings of excess rage, they have nerfed Booming Voice by 33%, they've removed the rage generation from Champion's Bulwark, they've reduced the rage that Blood Surge generates, they've hit Violent Outburst by a 50% nerf, and they've removed the rage that you can gain from Impenetrable Wall. There were some other changes as well that directly affect the class's overarching playstyle, and this is where my gripe really stems from. So they have significantly reduced how often you can get Shield Slam procs from Devastator and Strategist. This is causing the Warriors to have absolute dead globals, where we're not only rage starved, but we can't hit Shield Slam or Thunderclap because they're on cooldown. These rage nerfs also make it fairly difficult to keep Ignore Pain active alongside Shield Block, especially in single target. I truly believe that Blizzard missed the mark with these changes because excessive rage generation really came from Mountain Thane, one of their 2 hero talents. By nerfing core abilities, you're basically burying Colossus in the dirt and leaving Mountain Thane as a hollow shell of its former self. I'm going to go into more detail here shortly with my testing. I find this significantly frustrating because this tier set, plus the higher M level we were getting with haste, was actually going to start leaning towards Colossus, which is already difficult to play and definitely the least popular choice out of the 2. It's like I said, hey, Blizzard, it's a little hot in here, can we open a window? And Blizzard just tears the whole fucking house down. Now, going into PTR, I was extremely discouraged because I knew what was coming. But anyways, I reluctantly got on PTR, I got my 4-set, I set up my bars, and I found some pretty cool trinkets that I wanted to test as well. In my previous video, I didn't mention these, mostly because I was going to make a video going over all the trinkets, but I'm running Reverb Radio, which is a ramping haste trinket with really solid uptime. And I'm running Improvised Sephorium Pacemaker, which causes your first hit every 60 seconds to grant you a lot of critical strike. And then when you critically strike inside of this buff, it's going to extend that buff for up to 15 seconds, which gives this trinket actually really high uptime at its peak. I figure this would work nice with the tier set since we do want to push our crit a little bit higher to hopefully get more solid and consistent shield charge resets or at least cooldown reduction. And of course, I'm going to be starting with the Colossus tree because mostly I figured this was going to be the worst feeling one out of the 2 with all the rage nerfs. So I started off by jumping into a plus 12, and I want to explain a few things before we get in, just so you're all aware. We will be scaled to 665 idle level, which is the heroic equivalent. Plus, with it being a plus 12, it's going to remove the Xal'atath effect, so we can actually focus on playing the dungeon and not trying to manage a new dungeon with people who may or may not have seen the dungeon before, on top of dealing with Xal'atath's bullshit affixes. Also, side note, the bug still exists too that causes the timer not to appear. I found out later, or at least at the end of the run, that if you run out and run back in, it does fixed the problem, I guess, but I didn't do that in this run. So in this run, this is what I was trying to look for. First, obviously the tier setup time. This is going to be important because it gives us shield charge cooldown reduction, which is not only a stun, it's also a burst of damage, it's extra rage generation, and it's just more shield block uptime. The second thing I wanted to know was rage generation. I wanted to know how much we were going to generate, how much overflow was it going to be, and which talents are going to be working more in our favor. Third, and I think the most important thing that we all want to know, how does it feel to play a seemingly rage-starved warrior on paper? To my horror, and to my surprise, warrior didn't feel that bad. And let me explain. Sure, it was slightly noticeable that I wasn't spamming Ignore Pain or Revenge because I just couldn't, but on these larger trash pulls, I felt incredibly strong and incredibly sturdy. There's still plenty of rage that's going to be funneling in since we are taking damage from multiple instances. Shield Slam procs are generally higher in AoE, so naturally we had more rage and more buttons to hit. The real problem though really came in on bosses. This is where the struggle is. Luckily, fights like Big Mama are better since we have multiple targets to hit, but this boss still does some nasty tank damage. As we reduce our target count though, we tend to have significantly less resources to work with, which is, I think frustrating is the only word I can really think of. This class has always had some of the highest APM, not just out of the tanks, but out of all classes, since we don't just have one, but two rage dumps that are off the global cooldown, and one of them doesn't really have a cooldown outside of the internal, which is Ignore Pain. With the rage nerfs on single target, I thought that maybe even shield block would be difficult to maintain, but the tier set combats this slightly by giving shield charge some pretty solid reductions, meaning that we're able to get shield block refreshes and extensions. Of course, this buff is slightly RNG based on our tier actually proccing, but it's noticeable when it does, because inside of that 10-second window, it's quite easy and manageable to get 3 Shield Slam casts, which, with the 50% increased critical strike chance, means that you're gonna at least crit 1 or 2 times, which means that every time this does proc, you're reducing shield charge by about 15 seconds or so. While shield block uptime did feel great, it was Ignore Pain that felt really difficult to manage, specifically on single target. Now, we did end up timing this run, and you can see my damage breakdown here. It's not perfect, definitely more spell reflect potential, which I can talk about in a second, but it's not as bad as I thought. What I noticed though is that luck of the draw uptime was incredibly low, and it's the lowest out of all the tanks that I've tested so far. Now, I thought that maybe this is a fluke, but this ended up being consistent across all my runs. Now, maybe I don't know if it's because how block works with the warrior. Classes like VDH and Brewmasters get to double dip on damage taken because of the dots they apply to themselves, but classes like Warrior and presumably even Protection Paladin may just see lower uptime on these because of how block operates. Oh, and one last thing I wanted to see was rage generation. You can see here that we actually had 0 overflow, which is kind of surprising. Not once was I capped, which I think is what Blizzard was aiming for. It's the intended goal, but you can see that Blood Surge was only a measly 2% of my rage generation, which is kind of piss. Besides Shield Slam and Thunderclap, and of course along with the rage we naturally generate, no ability was more than 10%, which I found interesting. Anyways, I wanted to get another run in because Warrior does feel strong in this key in particular. One thing I noticed was that my shield block uptime was incredibly high, which made me think I could get away with not running enduring defenses. I'll just cut to the chase, it was not good. You'll want to run this talent. I also tried swapping to Unnerving Focus, a talent that increases rage generation for the duration of Last Stand. Now I'm going to say that this talent actually felt exceptional during those windows it was active. This talent paired with something like Bolster allow any rage that's generated during this window to be funneled into Ignore Pain, and maybe some Revenge for extra damage. The second run had similar results again, like I said with the tier, just a sad little 11% uptime. But what was nice is while running Unnerving Focus, there was a 7% increase on rage generation over the course of the key. Definitely could push more out since I didn't necessarily use it on cooldown, but it's all very interesting. I can go on and on about my Colossus testing because there's a lot of little things I want to pick out, but I don't want this video to be 30 minutes long. So I'll be honest with you guys. I did not want to test Mountain Thane because I thought I knew what the outcome was going to be. I thought it was just going to be better. It produces significantly more rage than Colossus does. Oddly enough, I felt so much weaker on Mountain Thane. This time around, we tested a 13, which maybe is the reason it felt a little worse, but similar to Colossus, the trash felt fine. If not, actually it felt better technically. The damage palette is just a little bit more consistent. Instead of relying on stacks of Colossal, you just get to really just spam Thunderclap and Shield Slam. The real issue arose though when we got to bosses. I felt way more starved when playing Thane because I was just waiting on procs. Instead of having Demolish as a rotational stop, the DRs also are just smaller than the damage reduction you're getting from Colossus. Demolish grants a sizable 10% DR, accompanied with a 5% passive, whereas Mountain Thane kind of needs the target to be affected by Thunder Blast. While it does put more damage into Shield Slam and the possibility of resets, it's too much RNG. Obviously, this was also a 13, so like I said, we are a key level higher, but I still felt incredibly weak on single target. Of course, without DBM and only a few reps in here, maybe I don't have necessarily like the timers down for the tank damage, but I was trying my best. Sadly, we didn't end up finishing the key because the Shaman rage quit on PTR of all things. Oh well. Once again, I found myself surprised. I assumed Mountain Thane would just feel better, and it didn't. Whereas I thought Colossus was dead on arrival, but it felt more natural with the new rage generation cadence. While Thane did feel more rage fueled in AoE, it doesn't necessarily feel stronger, and it was clear that it had some shortcomings on single target. One thing I will say though, regardless of these rage nerfs, is that the warrior kit is kinda busted for this dungeon. There are a lot of needs for group stops, and Shockwave comes in handy for that. There are also many mobs that you may want to stagger the damage from. These snipes being a great example. Since they can't be kicked, you definitely don't want to risk them all targeting the same player at once. So Stormbolt and even more shield charges definitely come in handy. Disrupting Shout is also super great for preventing these mobs from healing with their restorative algae, and since there aren't as many casts, this actually ends up covering a higher percentage of casts throughout the entire run. And let's not forget Spell Reflect. Obviously one of the more broken tank cooldowns out of the bunch. Of course, nothing compares to like Protection Paladin having an 8-second immunity on a 1.5 second cooldown, but Spell Reflect goes absolutely nutty in this dungeon. There are 3 big winners when it comes to this ability. These Blood Warpers on their opening bolts do some crazy damage. They always target their primary target and deal some absolutely heavy hitting damage. You also have Bubbles, which is the fish right after third boss. You can Spell Reflect one of the stacks of the dot, which does some serious damage as well. And then near the very end of the dungeon, these big lads have a 10-second cooldown tank buster that can be reflected. This spell has always been strong and has seen some crazy uses in Season 1, mostly like in Grim Batol, but that trend is only going to continue and get stronger in Season 2, especially with this dungeon being in the pool and the return of Theater of Pain. On top of that, Warrior Shield Block feels so phenomenal in this dungeon. Outside of a few instances of magic damage which can be countered with cooldowns, Ignore Pain, and externals, a lot of the damage does seem to be physical and blockable. Specifically on second boss, if you accidentally kill Kiza too early and Bront enrages, his wall-up spam does nothing. Just does nothing. So, okay, I guess I just want to end with a recap. Don't hate me, because I'm going to be a little positive here. But we can't be positive without being negative first. Blizzard. This was too much of a heavy-handed nerf with major oversights. After testing, I could agree that nerfing rage generation on certain cooldowns like Demoralizing Shout or their extra rage from shield charge can be healthy. I'll admit that. Especially as we approach higher and higher levels of haste. But I think to nerf all of the other talents is just too much. Like I said at the start of the video, Shield Slam resets being nerfed is really what made this class now feel clunky at best and miserable at worst. Resources are difficult to balance, especially when you have modifiers that directly increase rage generated, or secondaries like haste. There's a balance that needs to be struck, and I'm all for minimizing overflow of resources like rage, as long as it doesn't ruin the class. But you made one of the highest APM classes feel slow and clunky. While the design shift didn't necessarily fundamentally change how the class operates, it definitely, without a doubt, ruined reasons why warrior mains are warrior mains. I want to be clear, I want some of these changes reverted, but I also can't say that I didn't enjoy my warrior testing, specifically on Colossus. In Season 1, Colossus did feel clunky because of lower secondary stats, and people didn't really start playing it more until recently because we're now approaching that kind of peak item level, where haste is feeling good, especially on this haste-sniffing Zug class. Even with these rage nerfs, the tier set combats this by allowing you to have slightly higher uptime on shield block due to Champion's Bulwark. Demolish also grants a sizable damage hit and allows those moments when you don't have Shield Slam or Thunderclap available to be filled with this devastating AoE button, which feels good to hit, at least in my opinion. But until you have the 4-set, this is going to feel miserable. And that's not even addressing the issues in single target. I don't know how Protection Warriors are going to be able to enjoy Raid with how little rage you generate now. When looking at the tier set, even over 4 entire dungeon runs, it's averaged an 11% uptime, which is incredibly discouraging when you're looking at the frequency of things like Demon Hunter and Brewmaster proc rates. Essentially what I'm trying to say is this. This class is tolerable in dungeons, specifically trash pulls, and of course has some good utility, but it was absolutely miserable on bosses, and that's my concern. Boss fights, including Raid and Mythic Plus, is a large portion of what you're experiencing in PvE combat. Mountain Thane, on top of all of that, just feels worse somehow, especially in single target, despite having the ability to generate more rage, and I'm not sure why. I hope Blizzard fixes this, or at least the community cries out enough so Blizzard hears. I do want to end on a positive note though. Colossus did feel okay. The utility that warriors have also feels pretty good, and I'm hoping that videos like this, as well as community feedback, convince Blizzard to maybe revert some of these changes, specifically strategist. Anyways, without ranting too much, thank you so much to all my Patreon supporters, because without you guys, I couldn't make videos like this. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.